Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. We're waiting as other attendees filter in. So we'll give it just one more moment and then we will begin our program. Thank you all for joining us. We're now at 3 minutes past, so we'll get started. Welcome, good afternoon or good morning to all of you, depending on how far east or west you're joining us from. We're excited to have everyone here today. My name is Jason Clark. I'm the Director of Policy and Government Relations here at Clean Prosperity. And maybe first off, to begin, for those of us that don't know, Clean Prosperity is an independent nonprofit. Our mission is really to promote effective climate policy that's good for our economy. We believe we can reduce emissions while increasing competitiveness and do it in a way that's affordable for Canadians. Many of you will likely know that we are very strong supporters of carbon pricing, but ultimately our goal is not about a single policy. It's about figuring out how we can move smartly to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in our economy. We've got an exciting event for you today. We have over 300 people registered from across the country, including Liberal MPs, political staff, departmental officials, a wide range of industry and environmental colleagues, plus a few members of the media. I would like to begin by acknowledging that I am coming to you from the unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe peoples, recognizing that we're all gathering virtually today, and so many of you will be participating from respective lands and territories beyond where I'm coming to you from. Our goal today is really to discuss the opportunities and challenges for implementing the federal climate plan. We're going to look to assess whether the Strengthened Climate Plan can achieve Canada's climate goals and offer some friendly advice to the government on where to prioritize and how to move forward. Our agenda today, we will be structuring our time over the next 75 minutes, where I will provide a few introductory comments, and then we're going to break it down into two parts. First off, I'll turn it over to Michael Bernstein, Clean Prosperity's Executive Director, to talk about our analysis of the climate plan and touch on our recommendations to the federal government. Next, we'll have a panel discussion featuring 4 prominent individual thought leaders that you'll all know well. They have extensive government and industry experience: the Honorable Bill Morneau, Martha Hall Findlay, Kate Chisholm, and Matthew Mendelsohn. And then we'll follow that up with a few questions from the audience. On a housekeeping note before we begin, as you may have heard, this event is being recorded. A copy of it will be provided to participants by email afterwards. We also will link the recording on our website and promote it on social media. If you wish, please follow us on Twitter, sign up for our newsletter to stay in touch. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask the panelists during the discussion, please use the Q&A function in Zoom. We will moderate the questions, myself and our team at Clean Prosperity, and we'll do our best to get through as many of those as possible. With that, I'm very excited to bring on our Executive Director, Michael Bernstein, to talk a little bit about our report that we released in December.
Great. Thanks, Jason. And thanks, everybody, for being with us today. It's great to see you all, at least virtually. I'm going to talk a little bit about a recent report that we put out evaluating the federal government's proposed climate plan. And specifically what we did for that report is we took all of the policies that were announced during the most recent federal election and in the months prior to that as well, And so you can think about carbon pricing, clean electricity standard, regulations for oil and gas, the Net Zero Accelerator Fund, building retrofit funds, on and on and on. There's dozens and dozens of these policies. We took all of them, we put them through an energy economy model that's run by a third-party partner, SMEA Consulting, in order to understand what was going to be the emissions impact and the economic impact of implementing these policies. And what we found is that these policies, if implemented quickly and effectively, would reduce emissions by between 37 and 41%, with the range depending on where future oil and gas prices might go. And so, of course, that gets us within striking distance of that 40 to 45% target that the federal government has committed to as part of the International Paris Accord. So what I'm going to do now is I'm just going to share my screen and try to bring up, actually, it looks like the screen is being shared, so that's great. So I will leave the screen share on and just ask if one of my colleagues could advance the slides to the first chart. There we go. So what you'll see here is a breakdown of the emissions reductions from the new climate plan. So specifically on the left-hand side, you're going to see a bar of 695 megatons. Think of that as the emissions trajectory prior to the COVID pandemic, prior to some of the new policies that have been announced. And then on the far right, you see the emissions reductions that could be achieved if all of the announced policies were implemented. And so the orange bars in the middle are where sector by sector those emissions reductions might occur. And so if you look on the left, what you'll see is oil and gas makes up the largest chunk of emissions, 62 megatons in our model. But you also see really meaningful emissions reductions in transport, in electricity, industry, and on from there. The only other thing I'll point out on this slide before we move on is if you look at the three orange bars to the far right within the gray dashed bar, those are 40 megatons of emissions credits that are being generated towards this 2030 goal. And they don't come from our energy economy model, but they come from data from Environment and Climate Change Canada. This is a relatively standard practice in modeling the 2030 scenarios. But those 40 megatons turn out to be really important. And they come from things like land use and land use change. That's the first 17 megatons. You've got credits, these 13 megatons coming in from the Western Climate Initiative, which is essentially credits being purchased in the California cap and trade system and being brought into the Quebec cap and trade system. And then you've got 10 megatons of nature-based solutions based on tree planting programs and wetland conservation and restoration, and a series of other nature-based programs. So let's go to the next slide. What you can see here is that this is showing the sectoral emissions reductions in a slightly different view. It's asking the question, what would be the percentage reduction we would achieve between 2018, which is the year where we have the most recent data, through 2030. And what you see here is it's actually only the electricity sector that in our model is projected to get a reduction over and above the 37% that we'll achieve economy-wide. And that's largely because of that 40 megatons of credits. But even if you look at the other sectors, building, industry, and on from there, you're going to see very meaningful reductions, 28%, 37%. Those are really deep reductions cuts that need to be achieved over the next 8.5, 9 years here. So let's move to the next slide. One way to see how challenging it is, because I like to say that it's one thing to run all these policies through a model and to theoretically achieve these reductions, but achieving this practically on the ground in this short period of time is going to be a very large challenge. And so this slide is just one way of illustrating this. This is showing the Alberta electricity generation picture consistent with a 37% reduction pathway. And what you'll see here is if you look at the second set of charts from the right where it says non-emitting, this pathway is suggesting we need to grow the non-emitting electricity in Alberta by 20 times between now and 2030. And that, just to put that in perspective, that growth would represent more than double the total capacity of the Alberta electricity system today. So this is a monumental task. This isn't the only potential pathway. This is the one our model thinks is the most cost efficient, but it gives you a sense of the challenge that really lies ahead. Let's move to the next slide. So here we want to give you a slightly different look at the data. This was an analysis we also put in the report, looking at what would be the impact on households of all of these climate policies. And we did this analysis in partnership with Dave Sawyer and Seton Stiebert. And what we found here, the punchline really is that that households on average would actually still be better off. And the reason is because the revenue from carbon pricing would be greater than the cost from carbon pricing and the cost to households from regulations and subsidies. And that's particularly true for folks in lower income brackets. So when we looked at it distributionally, we found particularly folks at $86,000 of income or below tend to be better off by $100, $200, $400, $500. Let's move to the next slide. So bringing this together, let's move to policy recommendations now. One of the things we point out in the report is that by 2030, even though there's this huge list of policies that are on the federal government's agenda, there's really 3 areas of policy where about 75% of the emissions reductions could be garnered. And you see those on the screen here. So that's the clean electricity standard, that's regulations for the oil and gas sector, including fugitive methane regulations. And then there's road transport policies, including off-road vehicles like mining vehicles. So that would be one way to get 3/4 of the emissions. Now, I will point out also that, of course, there is another way the federal government could get a meaningful share of those emissions reductions, which is to address the policy uncertainty around the carbon price. As many of you will know, the carbon price is scheduled to go to $170 per ton by 2030, but there is some uncertainty around that for industry and for investors, because there could be changes in government, there could be other changes to the policy. And so one way the federal government could address this is by putting in place policies like a contract for difference, which would essentially underwrite the carbon price and provide investors the certainty that they will be made whole even if the carbon pricing trajectory does change. And if folks are interested in that, there's actually a great memo from the C.D. Howe Institute that maybe we can post in the chat, but that folks can look at for more details. Let's go to the next slide. Actually, let's skip this slide and go to the next one. So this is the final slide. I wanted to talk a little bit about our 2050 policy recommendations as well, because while 2030 is clearly important and there's been a lot of attention on 2030, in some senses 2030 is like a midterm exam, and in some senses a midterm exam that we are now cramming for with only 8.5 years remaining. One of the things that we wanted to do as part of this report is also look at 2050 and understand what other policies might need to be put in place to complement the 2030 policies. And you can see 4 of our key recommendations on the screen, and I'll just run through them fairly briefly. So the first one has to do with mapping out the post-2030 path. This is about going sector by sector and looking at more detail on what is this pathway actually going to possibly look like to get to net zero. No one knows the exact future, but what we can do is look at scenarios. And if you look at other jurisdictions, the UK is a great example of this. You see their climate change committee, which is similar to our net zero advisory board, putting out very detailed modeling pathways for 5 illustrative scenarios, looking at what this transition will actually look like, and also putting out taking a carbon budget lens on it. So looking at what are the cumulative emissions in each of those scenarios, because ultimately that is also going to be very critical. So we think really investing in more modeling and encouraging more modeling of net zero pathways in Canada could be a really important part of the decarbonization agenda. And it's actually something that Clean Prosperity is pursuing, and we will have some reporting out on net zero pathways later this year. The second recommendation is around a carbon management strategy, which for us really is about both policies to accelerate traditional carbon capture and storage at point source at point sources like steel mills and cement plants, but then also critically supporting carbon dioxide removal technologies, things like direct air capture, enhanced weathering, ocean-based removal. By our analysis, we're going to need hundreds of megatons of these negative emissions technologies by 2050 and beyond. So it's going to be really important for us to have some sort of strategy nationally around how we're going to accelerate those technologies and build the needed infrastructure. And we've got to do that this decade if we're going to be ready for the scale up that has to happen in the 2030s and 2040s. Our third recommendation for 2050 is around full industrial carbon pricing. So this is the idea of transitioning from an output-based system like the one we have today and moving gradually towards a full industrial carbon price, and then pairing that critically with competitiveness protections, something like a border carbon adjustment, which would address both imports and exports and make sure Canadian businesses are still on a level playing field with global competitors. And then the fourth policy area is policies for net zero buildings. And this is getting at the idea that we really do need more policy and more thinking to mobilize the needed capital that is going to be required to make retrofits to up to 10 million buildings across our economy by 2050. That represents 1,000 buildings a day, every day starting today. So clearly it's a huge job. And it's one where we're going to need more policy to address the scale of that challenge. So those are our 2050 policy recommendations and some of the highlights of our report. I'm going to pause there on our report. And I guess we'll bring some of our panelists onto the screen. And as I do that, I will also introduce them. And I will just need a minute here to find the right place on my screen. So bear with me a second. Okay, so the Honorable Bill Morneau was Canada's Minister of Finance from 2015 to 2020. He played, as many of you will know, a key role in shaping the government's economic policies, including Canada's economic response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And prior to that, between 1990 and 2015, he led the multinational human resources firm Morneau Chappell. Our next panelist is Martha Hall Findlay. She's Suncor's Chief Sustainability Officer, and she was twice elected as a member of Parliament. She served in several official opposition shadow cabinet roles, and she's currently a member of the Minister of International Trade's Trade Expert Advisory Council. We also have with us Kate Chisholm. Kate is Capital Power's Senior Vice President for Planning, Stakeholder Relations, and the Chief Sustainability Officer. And she's been responsible for legal matters affecting all of Capital Power's activities since its inception in 2009. And prior to that, she held senior executive roles at EPCOR and at Alberta's electricity system operator. And then we have Matthew Mendelsohn with us as well. He's a professor and co-founder of First Policy Response at Ryerson University. He's a senior advisor to Boston Consulting Group's global public sector practice. And from 2016 to 2020, he was the deputy secretary to the cabinet, where he led the Prime Minister's Results and Delivery Unit and the Government of Canada's Impact and Innovation Unit. So that's just a small sampling of the long history of many of our panelists. So welcome to all of you. It's good to have you with us today. Bill, I'm going to start with you, if I could. I guess the question I wanted to start off with was asking you, from your perspective, how you think the government should approach the really ambitious climate agenda that it has set in front of us. And as part of that, if you wanted, you could also flag for us if there were any particular policies that you felt were important to emphasize, or for that matter, de-emphasize.
Well, great. Well, first of all, thank you for having me here today. It's great to have the opportunity to be with the other panelists and to have the chance to talk about what I think is probably the most important policy issue facing our government and facing our country, which is our energy transition and how we're going to face up to these challenges. So from my perspective, just if I do a retrospective back to the time where I was Minister of Finance in 2015 to 2020, and think about what were the most important things we achieved, I have to start with the pricing of carbon. I have to say that if we think about what is most important for us as we try and deal with a challenge that that is larger than we can really conceive of. It is, for me, the pricing of carbon. So when I think Jason started out and said, you know, while your group, Clean Prosperity, believes in a carbon price, but it's not necessarily a single policy, you know, I might say that from my perspective, it almost is a single policy. It almost is the thing that we should start and end on in terms of our emphasis, and realize that that's the basis from which pretty well everything else that we achieve will come from. So I put my focus there in terms of what the government should be doing. And I clearly look at how are we going to make the greatest impact possible from that carbon pricing approach. And I look at a few different issues. First of all, obviously, and I hadn't heard the phrase, the contract for difference phrase, but we need to get certainty around that pricing of carbon. There's just no way for industry to play the role that it needs to play, for all of us to be engaged in doing the things that we need to do if we don't have an understanding of what that pricing looks like over time. We right now have people trying to make decisions on their investments, adopting new clean technologies, and they won't do it if they don't have a clear understanding of what that is. So I start there and say that anything that the government is able to achieve around creating certainty against that policy is to all of our benefit. So that's critically important. The things around that, though, are also particularly important. I think we need to make sure that there is transparency around what carbon emissions are across our economy. So when I look at the task force on financial disclosures, it sounds like something that's fairly arcane, but it's not. If we have organizations that are clearly reporting on their carbon emissions, that are transparent in what they are and transparent in their objectives, it makes an enormous difference for all of us to decide how we're going to make investments, what we're going to do in the future. And it will help those organizations to decide where they're going to place their bets for the future. So I see that as a critically important area of focus. And that brings us to other things. It brings us to a realization in some cases of what decisions will be uneconomic for businesses. There will be uneconomic decisions on climate adaptation technologies that will come into play because we'll see about the real emissions. We'll understand the measurement. We'll understand where firms can make investments and where they can't, which provides what I would say is a third area of emphasis from my standpoint. And that would be thinking about how government can make the uneconomic economic, because we all have to be engaged in this transition. We have to recognize that it's a transition, and that transition will meet points where it will be very difficult to move from that point to the next point because either the technologies aren't there, or they're just too expensive, or firms will need to get together to work together on something. And it will only be feasible if, in fact, government has some sort of way of moving into some of these challenges, whether it's blended finance or whether it's some sort of alternative that creates a pool of funds that people can work from. And I would use all of these measures, and I would think about them from my perspective, the way I always tried to come at things while I was the Minister of Finance, and that is industry-wide. I wouldn't be trying to specifically aid one particular investment for one particular firm. I'd be trying to come up with measures that will enable multiple firms to go at and find the opportunity to create, from their standpoint, the advantage that they can create from a policy that is set up and intended to help across the entire economy or across an entire sector. So Michael, I won't go on much more, but I do come back to the fact that it may not all be about carbon pricing, but from my perspective, it's pretty close to all being about carbon pricing.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, we often say it should do the bulk of the heavy lifting, and I think that sounds consistent with what you're saying. Martha, maybe I could turn to you next. I'm curious, first of all, for you to talk a little bit about, from the perspective of the oil and gas sector, what do you see when you look at this climate plan, and where do you see some of the potential opportunities to work collaboratively with the government, and perhaps where are some of the challenges from your perspective?
Well, if we had several weeks, we could cover all of that. But first off, thanks for the invitation to participate. This is great. It's great to see everybody. And probably useful just to give folks just top line what we actually are at Suncor. We're one of Canada's biggest companies. We are an oil sands company, but we upgrade, we refine, we have offshore East Coast, we have offshore UK and Norway, we have refining in the United States as well as in Canada. We have the entire Petro-Canada retail distribution center. So really big integrated energy company. We do get labeled with that, yeah, but you're an oil sands company, which we are. And we've done a really good job of that over the last few years, and certainly in the last couple of decades, a tremendous focus on all things sustainability. So for example, Suncor has been a supporter of a carbon price for over 20 years. And Bill, I have to say, it may not be the only policy, but it sure is a critical one. The challenge that we have, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit later, is that if it isn't global, it does create some really big challenges, particularly for export-based industries like ours, because a border tax adjustment doesn't help competitiveness if you're exporting, right? So we can talk about that. But I also would like to say that on the disclosure thing, Suncor's won awards for its report on sustainability and climate report that we've been doing for years, with a very firm view that you have to disclose, you have to be transparent, not for the sake of disclosing and being transparent, which I think a lot of people think with the big move to more disclosure. The only purpose of good disclosure is so that you can act on it and actually expect performance. And that's something that we're proud of. I will also say, as of yesterday, it was announced that I'm taking on a new role, which is pertinent for this discussion because we've recognized that sustainability is so large. I've now effective next week, I'll be the Chief Climate Officer for Suncor.
Fantastic. Yeah.
So an opportunity to really double down on this stuff. So I'm really excited. It is a huge challenge. I firmly believe that Canada is up to the challenge. I mean, look at what we've been able to do with respect to COVID. Has it been perfect? Absolutely not. But look around the world, I think we should be pretty darn proud, especially when we have such a disparate country with different regions and different provinces. We can do this stuff. We just have to actually make sure we establish the right levels of collaboration. Bill, you're absolutely right. A big part of government's role is to help where something isn't economic and it's not going to happen on its own in the private sector. Government does have a role to play in helping make things economic. You know, I know Michael Alvich has to talk about our Pathways to Net Zero project. Just to say, in the oil sands, we're not all of oil and gas. Oil and gas right now represents about a quarter of Canada's emissions. We in the oil sands alone represent 10% of Canada's emissions. So I'll be able to speak a little bit more about what we're doing in the oil sands, but we have big emissions reductions by 2030 and net zero by 2050. So it's going to be hard, but I'm confident we can do this if we really double down and do it together.
That's great. Thanks a lot, and congratulations on the new role. That's interesting news. Kate, maybe I can turn to you next. Kind of a similar question. I'd love your overall thoughts on what this plan means for the electricity sector, what you see as some of the opportunities and what you see as some of the challenges.
Well, thanks, Michael, and like the others, thank you for having me here. This is fun. I've heard a lot of things that I already agree with. I agree with both Martha and Bill about the carbon tax, and certainly we see the carbon tax's effect in Alberta maybe a little bit more acutely than we do in other places. In Alberta, in the power sector, we compete to be able to generate into the market, and we are only paid for what we kill. So we are not paid for idle capacity, unlike any other province in Canada. And we all add the carbon tax to the variable cost that we bid into the market. But of course, renewables don't do that. And so the impact of the carbon price, which by the way, Alberta's had a carbon price since 2007. We're all over that. But what it does is it makes less efficient units more expensive, which is what it's supposed to do. And so, for example, we think that when Capital Power repowers two of its coal units, which will be finished by 2023, that reduction of their direct emissions will be 3.5 megatons, but they'll also cause a whole other megaton of reductions just by forcing older, less efficient units off the market. And so that's a huge opportunity. And of course, all of that is incenting a whole bunch more renewables. We do think in respect of the carbon tax, though, there is a but. And I think at the moment it's doing its job, because what it's doing is it's rendering technically but not economically viable technologies economically viable, which is the job of a carbon tax. If the carbon tax overtakes what is technically viable, then it becomes just a tax. It just becomes punitive. And so we're going to have to watch that. But based on Alberta's tier carbon policy framework and the federal government's carbon tax, we believe, based on our modeling, that Alberta will get to under 10 megatons in its power sector by 2030, which is what it needs to do for the 40 to 45%. And so we think it's on a very good path. From a challenge perspective, one of your slides, Michael, addressed sort of Alberta uniquely. And of course, Alberta has a unique resource challenge because we don't have hydro like BC, Quebec, and Manitoba. So we've got to deal with that. And the market that pays generators only what they kill is another challenge. So stranded investment, as was mentioned by Bill, is a really important challenge for Alberta. We're going to need to make companies comfortable investing in the billions and billions of dollars that, for example, CCUS, which is, in my view, one of the technologies that will contribute to 2050s or Alberta's 2050 net zero, will be viable for them, so their shareholders don't assassinate the executives.
That's fascinating. Maybe I could actually ask you a quick follow-up on that in terms of your mentioning of getting down to 10 megatons of emissions by 2030, because it strikes me, and you alluded to the slide, that this is going to be one of the largest challenges. There's many challenges across our economy, but the Alberta electricity system in particular. Could you just talk, maybe just share an extra minute of detail on how you see that decarbonization happening? And you referenced CCUS. Is it a lot about that technology, or is it a mix of that and interties and renewables? Maybe just give us a little bit of a picture of what you see over the next 8.5, 9 years.
Well, like you said in the beginning, actually, we've divided our pathway to net carbon neutral into pre-2030 and post-2030. Pre-2030, we see only currently viable technology being used because, as you said, there's only 8 years. And so by the time you finance, plan, design, build, permit something in this country, there's not much room left for more R&D. So we're concentrating on CCUS before 2030. And to get to the 10 megatons, we've announced that we're repowering 2 of our subcritical units to natural gas. And there's a difference between repowering in the power world and converting. So we're actually going to replace the turbines with new turbines that will be hydrogen ready when they're called to service. And then we're going to be also attaching CCUS to them. And so from the repowering alone, we increased their capacity by 40% and reduced their emissions by 40%. So that's 3.5 megatons. We also pushed the other megaton out of the market. And then by attaching CCUS onto them, we have another 3 megatons. And so that one alone, if you consider that in 2019, Alberta's power sector was emitting 31 megatons. And it needs to get down to 10. So that's a third of the reduction it needs to do all by ourselves. And so there are other companies doing the same thing.
Sure. Thanks, very helpful. Matthew, maybe we could go to you next. So could you talk a little bit about, others have mentioned that this is an ambitious agenda. There's lots of policies. And I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about what this means for the public service. Like, is there going to be ways in which the public service needs to organize itself, reorganize itself to be able to implement such an ambitious policy agenda?
Thank you, Michael. Again, thank you, everyone, for having me. And So success on any big complex issue is always about getting three things right. It's about getting the politics right, it's about getting the policy right, but it's also about getting the implementation right. And I think that, just to build on what Bill said, I think it's useful to highlight how much change there has been on the politics over the last 7 years, and Bill and others made enormous progress with the carbon price, but other initiatives as well. And I do think the politics has changed. It's difficult, certainly for the current government, to reverse itself. And I do think the politics has changed, and the public will continue to place pressure. I think the policy that's being articulated is largely right. The carbon price, but the net zero accelerator, a whole series of initiatives in the mandate letters that are going to have enormous impact. There are also the less talked about policies, which are more about how the government operates, standards, reporting, disclosure, procurement, all of those kinds of rules. But I think, again, the political direction and leadership that the government has articulated recently, but since 2015, is on the right path. The question is how quickly all of this can be implemented, and whether it can get done efficiently, whether we can assess which things are working, which things aren't working, which things are delivering return on investment, which ones are not. Are we spending enough time engaging communities on the ground, private sector and others, about whether the policies are actually going to work or whether they need to be adjusted? So the implementation piece is really important and tends to get less attention. But as everyone knows, traditional government structures are not good at addressing complex, horizontal, whole of government societal challenges. And we don't have to repeat all of the cliches, but we have Westminster system, things are organized vertically around ministries, things are siloed, people are risk averse, it's difficult sometimes to engage partners. So all of those things are well known, and it's obviously a concern for everybody, for every Canadian, that we will end up kind of defaulting to ordinary processes, taking too long, not being intentional about the need to move quickly and find new structures. People on this call would probably know, but lots of people outside Canada or citizens wouldn't know, that the Minister of Environment and Climate Change has almost no tools to deal with environment and climate change. The Minister of Climate Change relies on the Minister of Natural Resources Canada, and the Minister of Infrastructure, and the Minister of Finance, and the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. All of them have a whole bunch of tools, and for all kinds of reasons, at infrastructure, top of mind is not climate change. It requires an intentional act of the Prime Minister, of the government, of the Clerk of the Privy Council, to move the whole system to focus on these complex horizontal challenges. And so, to me, that is the big challenge. And governments can do it. Public services can do it. We saw over the last 2 years with COVID, can respond quickly to a crisis. Certainly in government, and Bill would remember this, we developed new focus structures to focus on cannabis implementation, where you had political staff and bureaucrats from 12 different departments meeting every week over the course of a year, but it was 1 year. And COVID is kind of a once in a lifetime crisis. Climate change is going to require decades of work to continue to focus. And can the public service sustain repeatable processes, repeatable structures to deal with these horizontal challenges? So, they certainly can, and they know how to do it. But it means, setting up new routines, setting up new accountabilities, meeting regularly in a horizontal way. The Minister for Industry, for example, is responsible for the Net Zero Accelerator. That's to help industry decarbonize. They have to be focused on this, and their teams have to be focused on this with natural resources Canada and with environment and climate change kind of on a weekly basis, and making sure that every day progress is being made, because it's very easy to default to ordinary routines, to not have the focus, to the sense of urgency. And this is something that requires urgency, for decades. And that's a huge challenge.
Thanks for that. Bill, I'm going to come back to you now. I wanted to ask you about your perspective around economic competitiveness, because while we have this ambitious climate agenda, we also have to do it in a way that sets up our economy for growth and that ensures we remain competitive. And I think a couple of other panelists have actually mentioned that in their earlier comments. So from your perspective, how should we be thinking about this? How do we stay competitive or even increase our competitiveness as we pursue this decarbonization agenda?
Well, obviously this is the enormous challenge that we've tried to wrestle with over the period of implementation of carbon pricing. And we've come up with a system that addresses industry separately from carbon pricing for individual decisions. What we're going to be faced with is that this is going to be a moving target. So it seems to me we need to be doing a lot internationally to try and push forward the advocacy for things that will allow other countries to move forward at a pace that enables this transition to happen. That's hard. It's not going to just be about advocating for a carbon price. It's going to be working together with global institutions in technocratic ways in some cases, in practical ways that will enable for change to be encouraged in other parts of the world. There will be potentially an ability for border adjustment taxes, carbon border adjustment taxes to play a role. But I heard and agree with Martha's point of view that these are not a panacea, that they don't necessarily give us an ability to do things here that doesn't have to recognize what's going on in other parts of the world. But as other countries look at carbon border adjustment taxes, that might provide some opportunity for some working together with countries to make change. And if I look back at what happened over the course of the time I was in office around a consensus among the G7, largely a consensus around the G7, increasingly among OECD countries around digital taxes, around minimum taxation for global corporations. That built slowly. It started with the G7, started with some members of the G7 and expanded out. Everyone wasn't always on board, but it gradually grew to a place where we made progress. So that will need to be the way we take this approach around border adjustment taxes. We won't be able to be unilateral in our decisions. We will have to be working together with countries around the world. And then we're going to need to look at how we find a way, as I said in the opening comment, to make some of those uneconomic decisions around adopting clean technologies economic, because that will enable our firms that might be facing a carbon price here and competing with people aren't otherwise to adopt technologies that allow them to move farther along the path than their competitors might be doing in other jurisdictions. So Michael, there's no easy answer to these things. We're going to have to constantly look at it. But I do think making sure that we are engaged in looking at on a sector by sector basis how we can enable those transitions to happen will be the important way that we go from gray to green, because in many of our industries we are going to still be in those industries for a long time period, and we need to think about how we make them greener. And that's going to be a collaborative effort which starts with pricing but moves into adoption of new approaches and ends up, I hope, with a more competitive Canada at the end, because we've taken behaviors potentially faster than some of our competitors in other countries might have taken, creating opportunity rather than risk.
Great. Martha, I was going to ask you about the Pathways Initiative, but before I do, did you want to pick up at all on that around the border carbon adjustments and the way you might see that playing out from an oil sands perspective?
Well, I think just the one comment I would make is when we think of border tax adjustments, we think of goods, mostly goods, not even services, but goods going across borders. And we're a big exporter. Right. The issue for us is not because a carbon price makes our product more expensive, because we don't have that luxury. We're subject to global pricing, right? We're price takers. What it does, though, is that it affects our bottom line relative to our competitors internationally. I mean, we're a global company. We operate in a global demand environment. And so for us, we had a brutal year the last 2 years. I know people are saying, wow, oil's high now, but we also just had 2 really pretty brutal years and incurring a lot of debt. So we still have to be very conscious about that because we're a public company. We're not, some of the national oil companies don't have to worry about this stuff, right? We do. We have to pay attention to our investors. And when our investors see that at the same price of oil, our costs are higher, then they're going to be less inclined to invest in us. And we want them to invest in Canada, right? Because, the oil and gas industry is by far and away the biggest investor in clean tech, right? We have the wherewithal to do this. We're going to talk about nuclear, I hope. The oil sands could be by far the biggest single customer for small modular nuclear. Well, we want that to happen because then it can actually set the stage for global expansion of what we have in some really cool SMR technology in Canada. But we can only do that if we have investors that are continuing to be interested in investing in us. So it's a competitive thing that isn't necessarily the cross-border trade.
Yeah. But I think that's important, by the way, just to jump in quickly, because actually one of the questions I was going to ask you, and I think you partially addressed it there, was, a skeptic might say, as you kind of referred to, look, the oil sands is getting, I think the latest projections I saw might be up to $90 billion in free cash flow last year. How can we justify billions in public dollars going to it? And I think you kind of addressed that by talking about the international competitiveness. Maybe just come back to that for 1 second, just to take it head on. What would you say to someone like that?
So yeah, thank heavens, the price of oil is high. I don't, the folks I know who have to fill up their tanks don't feel that way. And certainly the Europeans are not particularly happy about being so dependent on Vladimir Putin, especially when there's a security problem and a high price problem. And this is, we're going to see this whole disorderly transition is a real concern, and we're seeing it, protests in Kazakhstan because of removal of subsidies for gasoline. We're going to see this around the world if we don't really pay attention to the orderliness required in this transition. But in terms of the global competitiveness and the fact that the price is higher now, yeah, we're still paying off the debt that was incurred in the last 2 years, because at one point the price of oil was minus 33, I think. Now, that didn't last for too long, but the nature of this business is exactly this. You all know, everybody knows Alberta has gone through some times of real boom and then sometimes of real bust. And so as a commodity-based industry, we can't just count on the high prices sticking around. We have to actually manage that. So do our investors. So hence that competitive piece. But you asked about pathways, and I really want to just talk a little. Yeah,
let's talk about that. And maybe you could talk about, as part of that, as you described that, if you could just talk about what role you're seeing, talk about the public-private partnership you envision here. What role is the government going to play in your view on this?
Well, frankly, I think that's one of the biggest stories about pathways. So first, just as background for everybody, the oil sands does represent 10% of Canada's emissions. So we're a big part of the challenge. Years ago recognized that we actually have to therefore be a big part of the solution, not just as Canadians, but because this is obviously a global challenge. And the oil sands have reduced our intensity per barrel by 30%. That's awesome, but it's not enough. And people rightly say, but we're really worried about your absolute emissions. And so the oil sands companies got together 1.5 years now. We've been at the CEOs and the steering committee, of which I'm a part. We've been meeting every single Friday for 1.5 years. Maybe we missed 3 different weeks. There's real passion, real drive to make this happen from the CEO level directly. So in June, we announced that we now have the 6 major companies in the oil sands. We represent 95% of the production. The smaller players have all said, we're with you, count us in. We just don't have the wherewithal to officially join. So basically, the oil sands made a commitment, not a commitment, our lawyers would never let us say that, but a plan to see us get to net zero by 2050. And I gotta say, like, we're not a software company. We're not a retail chain, right? We're oil sands companies. For us to get to net zero by 2050 is going to be really hard. But it took a long time for us to actually come out and announce it, because for us, it was really important to lay out what that plan looked like. So we have plan to 2030, phase 2 is to 2040, phase 3 is to 2050. By 2030, we expect a 22 megaton reduction. That's almost a third of our total, right? So we're about 68, 70 megatons a year. So that's a kind of a big deal. No question, the biggest foundational project of Pathways, it's not the whole thing, but the biggest and earliest piece of this is a foundational CCUS project, not unlike what's happening in Norway with the Longship Northern Lights project, or the Porthos project in Holland, some projects in the United Kingdom, and now we're seeing significantly more happening in the United States. So it's not like we're leading in this. We used to lead in Canada with our Boundary Dam and Quest projects, but this is an opportunity for us to really pick that up. It's a cost. Carbon, there might be some revenue associated with CO2 at some point, but not really. And, it's quite different when you pull stuff out of the ground and sell it on a global market to taking stuff and putting it back in. You don't generate revenue from that. And so as a net cost, we're talking over the course of 30 years, billions of dollars. Absolutely, industry has to play in that and pay for it, no question. But we can't do it alone. Our investors, what somebody earlier said, your investors would shoot you. I think that was you, Kate. Oh yeah, our investors have been very clear. Do not do stuff like that. So it has to be a collaboration, and Pathways is actually generating international interest now because of the level of collaboration. Kudos to this federal government. It is not easy politically, but the effort that is going on to be at the table with industry, recognizing that this is the biggest single drop in reductions that we can be looking at for the next number of years. We know the technology, we actually can implement it, we can build it. This is an early big opportunity for significant reduction. So Government of Alberta, 6 major competitors all collaborating together, and the Government of Canada. It's a pretty, it's groundbreaking. And frankly, I think it's going to be game changing for the industry and frankly, Canada's reputation.
It's notable to hear both you and Kate talk about CCUS and what an important piece it's going to be, especially over the near term as other technologies get developed. Maybe at this point, just before I come to you, Kate, on this, I will say that there has been, and folks may have seen in the media, a letter signed by a number of academics over the last week kind of opposing CCUS. And actually, I have a response piece with Ed Whittingham out this morning, an op-ed in the National Observer, if folks want to see that. But we really do think that we need a more nuanced conversation about these technologies here, because ultimately, this is about reducing emissions. This is not about favoring or opposing technologies in our view. So maybe on that front, just sort of staying with the broad topic of carbon capture, but perhaps moving to the carbon dioxide removal portion, Kate, I could ask you a little bit about where Capital Power sees those technologies, how important they might be to the future decarbonization agenda, because I've heard you talk about some of the investments you've already made and some of the potential you see in those technologies. So maybe you could just paint a picture for our audience about where that fits in for you.
Thanks, Michael. Everybody has talked about using technologies that are currently proven pre-2030, and that's capturing emissions at point source. And so we'll do that through combustion capture or hydrogen blending. Later on, in post-2030, what we've already started to work on is the negative emissions technologies. And we will be bringing online this year something called the Genesee Carbon Conversion Center that captures carbon from our flue gas at our Genesee 3 plant, which is converting to gas. And it converts that carbon into what are called carbon nanotubes, which look like little tiny cake sprinkles. And here, I have a vial of them. And what we're hoping can be done with those carbon nanotubes is they are stronger than steel, lighter than aluminum, and more conductive than copper. So they have a lot of potential usages in construction materials. We have a partnership going on with Lehigh Cement right now, which, as you're aware, is one of the world's largest cement manufacturers, to see if the incorporation of them into cement will enable cement projects to use less cement, thereby avoiding the downstream emissions that are created from producing all of that additional cement. And we see similar applications for them in aluminum and steel manufacture, even rubber tires. And there are some uber cool applications for captured carbon out there that don't involve enhanced oil recovery and don't involve sequestration, but rather would convert the carbon into completely inert substances. Air products in Manhattan is making vodka. So if any of you are drinkers, please buy some carbon vodka. And we see this direct air capture with these things as being the future, because if a revenue or if a market for those carbon products can be created, the revenue that's generated by the sale of those projects will offset the cost of capture. And then direct air capture on its own becomes economic. So thanks for that question, Michael.
Yeah, no, that's great. I appreciate that. Matthew, turning to you again, one thing we haven't talked about yet is the role of the provinces and the need for the federal government to partner, I guess, with the provinces, but frankly, with other stakeholders as well, with industry, with Indigenous peoples. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how the federal government should approach. I mean, you talked very eloquently about how the Minister of the Environment and Climate Change is relying on other ministries. But I think in addition to that, they are very reliant also on what happens at the provinces. So talk about how the federal government needs to think about moving forward in partnership with provincial partners.
Well, there are lots of opportunities to move forward with provinces, and the current federal government has done a very good job on lots of things, Bill, in terms of Canada Pension Plan reform and helping people have more secure retirements, on childcare, on infrastructure. The federal government can often use its spending power and the power of its purse to incent a variety of action. I think the key point is that the federal government will need to do a lot of work partnering with private sector, with community organizations, with provinces, with municipalities to move this agenda forward. So to give one example on an issue that I talked about earlier on terms of procurement, for example. At BCG, we have a report on the trillions of dollars of government procurement globally and how to try and move that to net zero. And moving government procurement to net zero would add very marginal costs over time. But municipal governments, provincial governments aren't necessarily organized to do that. So the federal government can play a leadership role and develop models and share those with provinces. Likewise, we've talked about climate budgeting, for example. There is no doubt that ministries of finance are better at estimating the impact of policy decisions on GDP or on the deficit or on the balance sheet than they are at estimating the impact of a policy decision on emissions or on sustainability or on inclusion. Or on equality. But governments are gradually starting to do that work, to have a more nuanced understanding of how budgeting works, integrating climate budgeting, sustainability, emissions right into decisions, having models that can be replicated, that can be used. So it's center of desk, not side of desk. For most public servants in a Ministry of Finance, it's only recently that those things are starting to come to center of desk, and there's so much understanding of impact on GDP or impact on deficit. So again, the federal government can play a leadership role by developing these models, by helping provinces or municipalities understand these kinds of issues. And likewise, the issue of climate finance and supporting the private sector and sending signals or sending guarantees. Again, these are things that the federal government is able to do in terms of transparency, reporting, impact that provinces, municipalities, territories can start to model as well.
Right.
Michael, I'd like to lean in here. First of all, I agree with what Matthew just said in terms of the importance of working together at many levels from a federal government and provincial government standpoint. But I'd like to focus on two really important things that the federal government and the provinces need to work together on, that it's critically important. First, the reality is that we need to find a way to ensure that our approach to carbon pricing is increasingly consistent across the country. So Canada is Canada, so it's always going to be asymmetric. We know that everything is not going to be exactly the same, but to the extent that we can work intensively Fed Prov together, in a way, a respectful way of the different levels of government to get to a much more consistent approach to pricing, it's going to be better for everyone. It's going to be much more important for investors if they have that frame. It's going to be important for the country that we're not trying to compete on a basis that is not one we should be trying to compete on. Secondly, our taxation system now is different province by province when it comes to our carbon pricing approach. So we need, first of all, in my estimation, to move as rapidly as we can to provinces being responsible for the carbon pricing and for a common approach to the rebate of that resource, that money that's been charged on carbon pricing. So we're charging against what we don't want, which is carbon, and we want to give back money, lower taxes in other places. And the provinces are the ones that have the greater fiscal need, frankly, than the federal government. So they are the ones that need to have access to those monies for the decision on how best to refund them back to citizens. And Kate earlier, when she was speaking, talked about if the price gets punitive. Well, the reason the price doesn't get punitive is only there if we're giving the money back to citizens so that they can actually see that it's not impacting them personally. And that way they'll not only recognize the merits of the approach, but they'll be able to be engaged in what we're trying to achieve together. And a little anecdote for you. I remember speaking to Bruno Le Maire, my colleague, the French finance minister, not long after the yellow vests. And I said to him, well, what we did in Canada was when we put in place carbon pricing, we refunded it back to the citizens. And it was like a light bulb went off. Clearly the idea that you refund it back means you're not going to have people with pitchforks in the streets because they're getting the money back in their other pocket. And you can actually control how much carbon expenditure you have, but you can't necessarily control what happens on your taxes. So to me, those are two things that the federal government and the provincial government need to be working together on aggressively to get that big thing right, which is the carbon pricing that will make the big difference.
Yeah, thanks for that. And I'll emphasize, just to build on that, it's critical that happens both on the retail side for consumers and small business and also for industry, because we have not yet seen enough of the revenue. I think we actually don't have certainty yet on where that revenue is going to go that's being collected through the industrial system as well. So I take that point. Maybe I could ask you what—
Michael, can I just, there was just something when Matthew said about
go ahead, and then
the federal government leading the provinces. And I know where that's coming from, Matthew. I know there's certainly the financial capability, the capacity, etc. But the provinces are often in really great places and positions to lead the rest of the country as well. And, I'm in Alberta and we have Alberta Innovates, and Kate was talking about the opportunities, whether it's graphene, carbon fiber, some of these really cool technologies. That's happening in Alberta. That's not happening in Ottawa. And there are examples across the country of innovations that are happening, of policies that are being developed. I really wanted to stress and a shout out to all the provinces and the people in the provinces that they themselves are actually leading in their own ways, because this has to be a collaboration. It cannot be seen as somehow federal, and that irks people for I think fairly obvious reasons. So I thought it was important. A shout out to, and now actually an awful lot of leadership happens at the provincial level, and it's the collaboration that is absolutely critical here.
Can I just say 100%? I don't disagree with any of that, but questions of how we do green procurement, how we do reporting on climate budgeting, how we do standards, all of the climate finance and blended finance stuff, all of the transparency and disclosure that we've been talking about that through the panel. You need common standards. That's my point, that this has to work globally and it has to work across the country.
We do, but I would suggest that there are an awful lot in the private sector who are far further ahead in terms of transparency, disclosure, procurement standards than any governments right now. So there's also leadership in the private sector that could actually be helpful to governments. Like I just think, you know, that the opportunities for even greater tripartite collaboration, if you will, are enormous and open a lot of opportunities.
So Kate has very patiently been waiting with her hand up. So I want to reward that and appreciate that she did that. Why don't you, Kate, why don't you jump in for, if you could keep it to about a minute, just because we're getting close to the time we need to move to questions from the audience, and then we'll proceed from there.
I just wanted to pick up on Bill and Martha's points. A lot of what is going to be needed here is just ensuring investability. And so that's where you get into contracts for differences and so on. I just wanted to pick up on a question you asked me earlier that I didn't answer about interties. I think the Atlantic Loop is probably a panacea for Eastern Canada. But to Martha's point, not only do you have to respect what provinces are doing, you have to respect their unique circumstances. And to put an intertie between BC and Alberta would strand investment in Alberta that would send a message that would last for generations. And so we need to sort of think carefully through the things that we do, because our struggles for 2030 are not technical. They are just with respect to investment. And so let's not overcomplicate things. And that I know that there are a lot of people federally that think that an intertie between BC and Alberta would be a panacea, but in fact, it would create another crisis.
Let's, if we can, I'm going to shift away from this piece of the discussion, though very interesting, and just wanted to actually zoom out one level to talk about the global situation for a minute. We touched on it a bit earlier, but Bill, if I could go back to you and just ask you a little bit about how we should be thinking about pricing, how we should be thinking about advancing the discussion globally around whether it be global carbon pricing, as the Prime Minister recently talked about in Glasgow, whether it be border carbon adjustments we talked about earlier. There needs to be, and you talked about it as well, more kind of international coordination. So how does Canada pursue that? How do we advance that agenda?
Well, thanks. You know, this is obviously, this is going to be difficult because we have players that are not going to be on the same page as we are. That's obvious. That's either because of their state of development or because of the nature of their economies and what they produce. So it is a big challenge. And I think going after that, you need to operate on all fronts. I would say, you know, you start with ideas like the International Monetary Fund right now is looking at what they call their Article 4s, which is reviewing countries around the world, their economic situation, and they're looking at whether climate has a role in that. Climate policies have a role in that, to think about the risks and the opportunities that are there. So you need to think about those sort of global institutions. We need to think about whether we have appropriate markets for, say, carbon offsets. Carbon offset markets are going to grow significantly over the course of the next decade. And is there a way that we can find a challenging issue where we get money to unbankable projects, and then to get money to projects that are barely bankable through blended finance, through an international institutions. So these are relatively technocratic issues that can actually have a pretty significant impact. And then, of course, there is advocacy. So you mentioned what the Prime Minister is doing. Of course, that advocacy needs to happen. It needs to happen, I guess, both in public, but also in forums where we have like-minded, concerned countries that are thinking about how they can deal with this. But there will not be an opportunity for Canada to be the only one going down a path all by itself. That action rarely works. So we'll need to think about how we work together with like-minded countries. Obviously, the French have been very forward thinking in this area. They have a very different situation than we do in terms of their sources of energy, so it might be somewhat easier for them. But we need to work together with other countries to think about how we can put in place policies that will have the kind of desired impact.
Great, and I think the G7 this year is looking like that could be a focal point with the German leadership there. They seem to be indicating they want to make this a priority. So very interesting. Let's see if we can sneak in at least 2 questions from the audience. We are running pretty close to time now, and so I apologize we can't get in more questions. We've got a lot of great ones, but the first one, and actually I see Jason joining, coming back on the screen. Jason, did you want to set us up for a couple of audience questions?
Sure, absolutely. Maybe I will start with the first question we actually received, which I'm keen to get everyone's take on, and that's from Ken Bosencool, who, full disclosure, is a Clean Prosperity advisor of ours, and his question was really as follows. So he provided a little bit of a background saying, in his view, Canada made much more policy progress on climate policy when it stopped talking about targets and started talking about stringency. So the $30 carbon price escalating to 170. His question is he right? Is Canada likely to make more progress by focusing on stringency as opposed to targets? So maybe I'll put that out to maybe Bill, do you want to start with that?
Well, you probably already have understood where my perspective would be. I mean, it seems to me that one of the things that's been positive as we look at the trajectory over the last decade in the climate change world is that the cost of technologies has declined faster than we expected, and the adoption of new sources of energy has expanded much more rapidly than we expected. So things happen much more rapidly once you put them into place. Getting that flywheel in motion is, in my estimation, at least around that stringency and around the confidence against those numbers. So if we can focus on that as a first order issue and think about how we enable people to make investment decisions against that, we may see that the charts that Michael put up are much less positive than they'll actually turn out to be, because people will take decisions because they will have the ability to take those decisions against a confident expectation of their alternative. And so that is certainly where I would place the efforts. It doesn't mean, as Matthew says, that we don't need to do many things along the way, but I think we need to judge where do you get 80 or 90% of the impact, and where therefore should you spend 80 or 90% of your time.
Does anyone else want to jump in on that, or I'll move to the next one? We got a number of questions on the output-based pricing system, which is currently under consultation and review right now, as opposed to full pricing, and that came from around industrial emitters and referencing a Corporate Knights recent report on the portion that industrial emitters pay on per ton. The question ultimately is, how can the federal government get that pricing system correct in terms of whether there's an output-based price with an increased tightening rate, as opposed to transitioning to a full industrial price, as Michael had kind of talked about? How does Canada get that right, considering we have an output-based system, and also considering the role of the provinces, as Martha and Kate pointed out? I don't know if there's anyone that wants to jump into that one.
I'll jump in, because it ties, my answer to that is tied to another question that came in from Robert Tremblay, I think, that I think is really important to just set the stage, and it does tie to output pricing. Robert asked, what does the oil and gas industry in Canada think are, the worry about decreasing demand for oil and gas in Canada, in effect tied to the increase in zero emission vehicles. And our answer is, we export most of what we produce. If we in Canada can get to zero carbon lifestyle, that's awesome. From our perspective, our focus is going to continue to be on global demand. And a little bit to Bill's comment, it only works, all this stuff only works if everybody plays, right? And right now, China is importing more oil from Iran because it's cheaper because of the sanctions currently being placed on Iran. Do you think China and Russia are actually going to pay attention to this stuff as opposed to take advantage? So we cannot ignore the geopolitics. The other part of global reality is that there is going to continue to be demand for oil around the world for decades to come. Everybody, even the IPCC, the IEA, everybody's acknowledged there will be some demand for oil. A whack still into 2050, into 2040. And even if it starts diminishing globally by 2050, there will still be demand. We don't produce a ton of that in Canada, but we produce some. Norway, it's interesting. Norway is working on a really interesting decarbonization vision, right? It's investing heavily in electrification of its offshore, heavily backing CCUS projects, which it views, frankly, as another form of public infrastructure. So earlier, but fundamentally, it's increasing its production. That oh gosh, it shouldn't be enhanced oil recovery. Well, we produce oil in this country and we export it, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. Look at Norway. It intends to prolong the benefits to the Norwegian people of its oil and gas assets by competing for market share against OPEC and Russia as long as global demand persists. Global demand is going to be there. So when somebody like the IEA says, oh, you know what, well, there will be all this oil demand still in 2050, but it's okay, OPEC will look after it. My answer as a Canadian is that pisses me off. Why on earth, especially if we can get our industry to net zero production, and then you add in all of our global leadership on all the other ESG metrics, why on earth shouldn't Canadian oil and gas be a globally preferred source? Why would we just, oh, it's okay, let the Russians and the Saudis fulfill that global demand? I disagree with that completely. It doesn't mean Canada and Canadians can't do everything that we can to be proud of our own behavior in terms of electric vehicles and reduced consumption, reduced emissions in Canada. That's awesome. But the reality of the rest of the world is we also have resources that can continue to provide economic prosperity, render them to net zero in terms of production, and still actually contribute. I think that's, you look at the Norwegian example, it's not like they're, a bad example. It's a great example. And it's one, frankly, that I think we in Canada should have a much more honest discussion about. So when we talk the question about production tax credit or production credits or production based, whatever the regulations are, you can't have that discussion without recognizing that, and it's not just oil and gas, it's other minerals, it's a whole lot of things that we produce in this country that only part of it gets used here. We can't be an island. And so whenever we're talking about these regulations, remember that what we do for ourselves and our own behaviors, that's one thing, but we are also a contributor to what's happening in the rest of the world.
So I know we're bumping up to time, but maybe I see Bill maybe wants to jump in and possibly Kate as well.
I have no interest in jumping in after that. That's great. I'll leave it to Kate.
The only thing I was going to add is that there are clean technologies being developed in Canada that will be ready for export.
Yes.
And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that as well. We can become a leader. We just need to be able to invest.
Well, on that positive note, I think that's fantastic. But we're just a few minutes over time now, so I'll maybe take this moment and thank the four of you for this discussion. It was that's exactly what we could have hoped for when we put this panel together. So thank you all. As we mentioned off of the top. Yes, of course, we love carbon pricing as well. So no, there's certainly that. And this webinar will be available. We will post that shortly. And each of you that have participated will receive a copy of that by email. And we've posted both that CD Howe memo that Michael referenced, as well as the op-ed in the National Observer from this morning that Michael wrote with Ed Winningham. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon or late morning, depending on where you are. Thank you again to our speakers, and we look forward to hosting you again at our next event.
Thank
so
you.
much.
Best wishes.
Thanks very much.
Thank you
Take
all.
care, everybody.
Bye.